Coming up on 101 West, we look at human trafficking here in the Valley, a hidden, misunderstood crime with devastating consequences. People entrapped with limited options of escape. Why does it happen? Who are the victims? Can one break free from these invisible chains? 101 West starts right now. Welcome to 101 West, a program produced here at 101 West Boardman Street, the locally owned studios of WFMJ. Now, this news program goes deep into issues facing the Mahoning and Shenango valleys. Tonight, we explore the multi-billion-dollar illegal market of human trafficking. It's a worldwide problem that is very much prevalent right here in the Mahoning Valley. Every year, men, women, and children are lured into situations where either by force, fraud, or coercion, they're used in some type of labor or commercial sex act. Some call it modern-day slavery. The victims are basically treated as commodities. What is even more disturbing, sex trafficking is often a hidden crime, so tracking the true number of cases is nearly impossible. The National Human Trafficking Hotline estimates that Ohio is one of the worst states for it in the nation. On tonight's program, you'll hear from some extremely brave individuals, women who found the courage to break the cycle from this learned helplessness they experienced and have become freed from the invisible chains that bound them for years. But first, Cindy Candy has a look at how human trafficking presents itself in our society.
It's no longer if you encounter a trafficked person, it's when.
Rachel, a trafficking victim of 15 years, saw firsthand men and women trafficked for sex and labor. Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, coercion, deception, or threat for the purpose of exploitation. It's something we're seeing both locally and nationally. Just last month, rapper Sean Diddy Combs had his homes raided in an investigation related to trafficking. That's a very high-profile case. Most of the time, it doesn't get as much attention and is hidden in plain sight.
I've worked with 19 victims of human trafficking on our campus. Some of them are homeless. During COVID, many of them returned back to their traffickers because there was nowhere else to go.
Trafficking is not to be confused with prostitution, which is consensual sex for money. Dr. Kimberly Melman Orozco, a leading expert on human trafficking, explains the difference.
When we're talking about consenting sex work or prostitution, we're talking about an adult, typically an adult who is consensually engaging in commercial sex activity for their own financial benefit, right? They are choosing to engage in exchange sex typically for money or something of value. With regards to sex trafficking or human trafficking, usually you'll have sex or labor, and you'll have somebody who is in a slave, like a modern slavery type of situation. They're having their food, housing, transportation controlled. They are having all of their money or most of their money taken from them. They're really deceived into an exploitative situation.
Although trafficking is believed to be prevalent in Ohio, the numbers are anecdotal. The hidden nature of the crime makes it difficult to measure. Stats from the Mahoning Valley Human Trafficking Task Force show between July 1st, 2022 and February of this year, there were 420 known cases of human trafficking. The task force believes these numbers to be a vast underrepresentation of the problem. Just this past September, task force agents participated in a statewide operation targeting buyers of sex and identifying potential trafficking victims. Locally, 24 arrests were made over a 3-day period. Since May 2023, the FBI had more than 1,600 pending human trafficking investigations, with cases found in every field office. That's more than double from the year before. Dr. Tony Talbot, Director of Advocacy at the University of Dayton Human Rights Center, says despite the problem, there is some awareness of the issue.
We don't know where we stand nationally as far as the state of Ohio. What we do know is Ohio was number 5 in the country for calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That's where that number 5 came from. So that's both a good news and a bad news number. So being number 5 in the country of all states means that we have a big problem here. But it also means we have a high level of awareness and people know how to call to get help.
What does trafficking look like? Undercover detectives with the Mahoning Valley Human Trafficking Task Force tell me they've seen it all.
It's an extremely large issue here. We've found sex trafficking in our area in a variety of different methods. One of the methods is simply drug related. We have a situation where we have a high number of opioid addicted individuals in our area.
The stereotypical pimp situation where a guy would take a few women and sell them on the streets is not what law enforcement says they're seeing these days. It's the drug dealers that have made a business plan out of trafficking men and women.
It's a very lucrative business for them, more so than actually selling drugs, to where they can take a female, sell that female 10, 20 times a day for a couple $100 each time. All they need to do is give that female just enough heroin to stay from getting dope sick, to keep from getting dope sick. So they have a product that they can sell over and over and over and over again instead of their drugs.
And when the victims don't perform for their traffickers, the drugs are withheld from them until they get to a point where they do anything to get their next fix.
Now try to get out. You've got a habit. You've got nowhere to go. You have no family. You have no friends. Maybe the only friends you have are the other women that are involved, the other victims. There's a trauma bond with your trafficker because he's the one that can give you all kinds of pleasure. He can take you and get your hair and nails done. He can get your dental work done. He can do all kinds of different things to make you feel pretty. All he's doing is dressing you up so that you are more appealing for sale. So now you're indebted to this guy because he spent all this time and money and called you baby and honey, and by the way, you're back out on the track. And if you don't do it, you don't get the drugs. And you do get beat up. And you do get worse.
We also have familial sex trafficking. A lot of times that also has a opioid connection, where a mother or a father will be addicted, and the only way for them to get their money for drugs or to get the drugs directly themselves is to allow one of their children to be molested.
Although drugs are a main factor, it's not the only one.
They blackmail, you know, they become intimate with them. Share me some intimate photos, and then, okay, listen, if you don't go do this, I'm gonna put these photos all over the internet. It happens, it's happening here. It happens here in our schools.
We deal with people from other countries to your neighbor. It's our, you know, people in our community. It's our daughters and you know, nieces and cousins and sisters. You know, it's any part of our community could be affected by it. You know, there's no geographical boundaries where a victim has to come through. No socioeconomic boundaries. You know, we've seen it affect every walk of life.
It's at truck stops where a lot of times trafficking begins. The major highways an easy hub for transporting victims to Youngstown, Akron, Cleveland, and other states. Sometimes victims are transported from other countries into our area to be trafficked.
It's not vans and Walmart parking lots late at night, you know, that snatch people up. You see all of that, you know, like someone puts something on your windshield wiper and you try to leave and it smears your windshield, so you get out to fix it, and that's when a van comes by and snatches you. That's never happened. That's just an urban myth, an urban legend that's getting you know, sent around social media. So well-intentioned people are spreading that on Facebook, and it makes people look out for scary people in vans and dark alleys and all this stuff. And then the actual trafficking victims and traffickers are working right there, and you're not even seeing it because we're all focused on some imaginary terror instead of the actual real horrible, you know, problem that really exists right next to it.
While random kidnappings are possible, Talbot says when it comes to trafficking, it's improbable.
In almost every case, a a victim is trafficked by someone that they know, someone who has worked to build, either already has a relationship with them, like a parent or a caregiver, a neighbor or a friend, or someone who's worked to build a relationship and to build trust with the victim.
And that's exactly how it happened for human trafficking victim Rachel Socorro. The trafficker took care of her. He bought her things and showed her what she thought was genuine concern for her. No one wants to become a human trafficking victim. It's not a choice. In fact, Rachel tried several times to get out. She broke free of those invisible chains 7 years ago and courageously shared her story with us.
So how does one find themselves in a situation where they're being trafficked? It almost always starts with a process called grooming. That's how Rachel Socorro, a trafficking victim of 15 years, was lured into captivity. It started when she was 19 years old.
I found myself very vulnerable, pregnant, homeless, and struggling to finish my senior year.
Then she thought she found a saving grace.
A family member of mine, he was working very closely in partnership with what looked like a very successful businessman. He had a significant substance use disorder, addiction, and his trafficker, he was being exploited as well, took a liking to me and began to insist and pay him to groom and recruit me. They started doing things like paying utility bills. They would drop diapers and groceries off at my door. They would give me rides, and all the while building a very close connection and establishing trust.
The trafficker becomes the answer to the victim's most prominent needs and vulnerabilities. Rachel quickly learned this was all part of a more sinister plan.
One morning I went out for coffee and paper, and I came back to the front door, and it opened before I did, opened it, and I was met with the barrel of a Glock 40. I was drug into the house by my hair and pistol whipped and threatened. My phone was taken, and I was told that I was never to leave that house again without permission. And in that moment, it changed very drastically from grooming and recruiting to total isolation.
From that day, Rachel was forced to be her trafficker's sex slave and run his businesses for his own financial gain.
I experienced a labor trafficking dynamic in addition to a type of sexual exploitation. I was in domestic servitude that whole time. So I was forced to care for him, you know, perform for him, whatever his demand was, on demand, any type of day, any time of day.
To make matters worse, Rachel's trafficker forced her to marry him, so then he could use her name and credit.
I had a watchman. He took me to work, brought me home. All of my paychecks were deposited into his account. I never saw a penny of it. And then we were going to start businesses. And one day he walked in the house and he said, "We're going to get married. It'll make things easier." So at force, I was taken to the courthouse and made to get a marriage license. And he called someone out of the phone book, and they came to our house and married us in the living room. It was over in like 40 minutes. They threw a party, and I went upstairs and cried myself to sleep.
What happened if you mustered the courage to say no?
No was never an option. No didn't exist in our vocabulary. The dynamic of trafficking that I lived in was we ate when we were told to eat. We ate what we were told to eat. We slept when we were told to sleep. We, had sex when we were told to have sex. Like, you did whatever you were told to do all the time.
Rachel was trafficked over and over, primarily in Youngstown and Akron. Judge Renee DeSalvo works with human trafficking victims and sees the extreme abuse firsthand.
The problem is every time that they end up being sold to someone, they're being victimized over again. It's just reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing that they can't trust anybody, that they're not worth anything.
Rachel tried to escape her trafficker on multiple occasions, and after 8 years, she got out. but only briefly. She made her way to a domestic violence shelter with her 2 children, including one fathered by the trafficker.
He was able to locate the shelter, had it, attacked, targeted. The state and the shelter paid to relocate us to Florida. We moved halfway across the country.
But it still wasn't enough to keep the trafficker away.
He again hired an attorney. They found an old patriarchal law in the state of Ohio that says if you leave the state with your children and you're married and do not notify your spouse, it's against the law. So a children's service worker came to the shelter, sat me down and said, "Miss, you have 24 hours to put your children on a plane and go back to the state of Ohio, or you will be arrested for kidnapping and extradited back, and your children will go back through protective services."
So 24 hours later, Rachel found herself back in Ohio, returning to her trafficker, an effort to avoid one form of captivity while still living in another. So after getting a taste of freedom, how did it feel to have to get off that plane and back into that car with your trafficker?
I remember him looking at me and saying, I'm looking at me in the eyes and saying, "What made you think that you could leave?" He always told me, "I own you. If you leave here, I'll kill you." Someone tells you that every day for 15 years, you believe them. And I remember just such a sense of defeat. I remember thinking in my head, like, what did make me think this would work?
Rachel remained in captivity another 7 years. Experts say the root of this bondage is not so much physical as it is psychological.
I think most victims are controlled by the invisible bonds or invisible chains. And a lot of that involves very horrific psychological and physical abuse. So if you're subjected to that much abuse, it builds trauma. And when you have that much trauma, sometimes it's easier to just go along with it, or sometimes people just disassociate or turn off, and so they just can follow the directions.
Rachel was finally able to make her escape after a conversation with a stranger. See, that conversation opened Rachel's eyes to the fact that her trafficker was unknowingly creating a way out for her by using her name and credit.
One night I was working with this young lady, and she was going through a pretty difficult life situation. She started sharing some of her lived experience, and it made me comfortable to begin to open up about mine. And she was listening, and she was like, "You own that house?" I was like, "It's in my name." She's like, "And you own those cars?" I was like, "They're in my name." She's like, "And you own those businesses?" I was like, "Everything is in my name." She's like, "Go home and take your life back." And it was like somebody flipped a switch.
Just like that, the chains were broken.
I came to a point where I would rather die than live like this. I got up around 7 or 8 o'clock and stole the car keys and drove downtown to what I thought was the police department. It ended up being the courthouse. I didn't even know still, you know what I mean, where, because I didn't drive, I didn't do anything. And I walked in the front door and I said to the deputy, "I need help. I'm being held captive." And he took me upstairs and he got me in front of a magistrate. And she told me, she said, "This won't stick." She got me a protection order because I didn't have any visible signs of abuse or assault. She said, "But it will buy you enough time to get out." And she gave the papers to the sheriff, and they went and swept our house and business, and by noon that day, I was free.
Rachel was trafficked from 2002 to 2017.
I remember walking out into the world in 2017. I didn't know how to use a smartphone. I remember feeling very vulnerable again, feeling like I felt when I was that 18-year-old little girl with a baby next to me. I remember thinking, like, who's gonna help me rebuild my life?
Rachel didn't know who she was or how to figure it out.
When you've been exploited and you have no identity, I never experienced adulthood. I went in at 19 and I lived every day under the authority and rule of someone else, my entire adult life up until that point. I didn't have a favorite food. I didn't have a favorite color. I didn't really know how I liked to dress. I didn't know me. There was no me.
Those invisible chains took more than just her freedom. They kept her from herself. Prosecuting these cases is no easy feat.
Some clients, you never break through that shell. They'll never trust you because you're part of the system. They've also been taught that if they talk about what's happened to them, they'll be stigmatized, they'll be labeled. Any comforts they have in the world, the food, the shelter, the drugs that they're addicted to, that will all go away if they disclose it to somebody, what's happening to them. So they have that fear of, this may be bad, but if I disclose this, it's going to be worse.
They have the trauma bonding with their abuser, the Stockholm syndrome. That's tough to break. Even if they're not doing this anymore, they're reluctant to testify against that person.
The Mahoning Valley Human Trafficking Task Force was formed in 2018 and to date has more than 930 trafficking or trafficking-related cases. Now, the disturbing part of that number, task force members believe the number of unknown cases of human trafficking is much greater. Now, it sounds like they have their work cut out for them, but there have been significant moves to identify the victims and get help for them.
Historically, the justice system has treated the victims as prostitutes rather than getting them the help they need.
I am sure that we had them coming through the court, but we didn't have the tools to identify them back then. We didn't have the knowledge base, the awareness of what actually was going on in the city at that time.
Would you say at any point in time that you feel like maybe the system then, now, whenever, have failed any of these victims, the justice system?
In a sense, yes. Are we failing them now? In a sense, yes, in that maybe we could be doing more.
After a discussion with the Mahoning Valley Human Trafficking Task Force, Judge DeSalvo created Grace Court. It's a program that works to rehabilitate victims of human trafficking.
I was mortified. I was ashamed that I didn't know that that was happening here. So when they asked me, would I help them? Would I start a court? I said absolutely.
Grace Court celebrated its second graduate this month, Jasmine Harrison. She was trafficked in Youngstown for years, drug addicted and arrested multiple times.
This program would change my life forever.
We have somebody who will go into the jail, or when a girl is arrested for whatever charge, we'll have somebody kind of look at their record, see, have they been in the system a lot? Are there consistent drug charges, any solicitation charges? And we will inquire. There's a questionnaire. If they answer these questions and are assessed as victims of human trafficking, we invite them to participate. It's all voluntary.
And if they complete the program, their criminal records are wiped clean. It took about 2 years, but Harrison is better off. She's working and hoping to study social work. Judge DeSalvo says it's important everyone learn to recognize the fact that these victims need help.
I began to look at people differently, and I regretted that the women that I represented, and I think back, there's still a few of them that I'm like, oh my gosh, if I would have asked the right questions, but yet I asked the wrong questions. I didn't ask enough questions, and I didn't know to ask them.
Which is why DeSalvo works with Youngstown police to train them on what to look for.
We had one officer that came up and said, I just stopped the guy, and I thought it was odd that this young woman was sitting in the front seat with him, and this young kid in the back, and he was older, and he was out of place in that area. He said, I never thought to ask. And that's really sometimes all it takes, is ask the question, be curious. If something doesn't look right, chances are it's not.
Dr. Melman Orozco believes it's important to educate children on what grooming looks like.
Informing kids from an early age on how trafficking happens, how sometimes it might not be, a visible bad guy, somebody who you know is a criminal who might coerce you or deceive you into a situation that does not have your best interest at heart and where you can be exploited.
That runs hand in hand with parents monitoring their children.
I think parents really need to get on the ball. I think parents really need to start taking control of those social media and all of their the equipment that they're giving to their kids. They better start paying attention to that. A lot of these traffickers are grooming these kids online through these gaming mechanisms, through social media. They're grooming them. They're grooming them. So these parents really have to understand that when these kids are online, you have no idea who's on the other side.
Some believe a change in legislation is needed, including decriminalization.
Decriminalize the sale of sex, but increase penalties for the purchase of sex. And the idea is that people wouldn't have to be exploited during commercial sexual exploitation if there wasn't a demand for commercial sex. So if we can go after the men driving the demand, we can reduce the profits that traffickers are making and reduce the overall number of victims.
I am involved in working with a group out of Cleveland and Representative Lauren McNally in trying to get some legislation passed where we would put traffic cameras at state-owned rest stops. And oftentimes the transportation industry is a huge hub for moving and transporting individuals in the trafficking industry. You have rest stops that are being used for people to maybe solicit. Also, you might have the drop-offs and pickup. They're going to exchange this person with someone else. With the traffic cameras, if we have those installed, we would be able to go back and look, potentially see what's the license plate number, what does the individual look like.
Rachel found her own way to help victims by teaming up with a friend to create their nonprofit called Total Life Wellness. Now, they help survivors to rebuild their lives.
It's my prayer that people would see me and know you can survive what you walk through. Yes, you can. And that you can heal. And you can grow, and you can love again, and you can thrive. That there is hope, no matter what.
If you think you know of someone who's being trafficked, please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888. Thank you for watching this edition of 101 West.